thing that I remember most about Rikers is that it has definitely taken a lot of lives, both physically, emotionally, right? People, there's different ways to die, and you learn that when you're on Rikers.
Rikers, Rikers has a history that goes way back to slavery, and this is what we see today is the ramifications of that. It is the evolution of slavery. And we gotta call things for what they are. We gotta call things for what they are. It is no secret that most of the folks you're gonna see at Rikers detained are coming from the same communities.
We, especially people of color, tell our histories at the kitchen table, right? And so in barbershops and on street corners and at people's homes and in these neighborhoods, the history is very much alive. And that's why it's so great that we have made the whole Rikers Public Memory Project accountable to people who are directly impacted. And so we can make sure to always acknowledge and affirm the fact that people have been telling their stories, and now we want them to be a part of public record. And I feel like that's what the Rikers Public Memory Project is really doing.
This is why the project is important for just the average Joe person, because guess what? Somebody you love may be incarcerated one day, or you. And besides that, it just is like, widen your base. Why wouldn't you give a shit? There's a jail in your borough. Maybe you should know what goes on. There's a whole jail in your borough, like maybe in your neighborhood. Maybe you should know what's going on with the people who go in and out of there. Why not know?
Rikers Island is the world's largest penal colony with 413 acres that can accommodate up to 15,000 people and an annual budget of $160 million. And it's the last historical penal colony in the United States. But interesting enough, it's not a prison. It's a series of jails. And the history of Rikers has never been published or been a part of the public record, even though it's central to New York City's history. But it does exist in the collective memories of those who have endured the trauma of Rikers. And it's that memory that the Rikers Public Memory Project seeks to activate.
The Rikers Public Memory Project collects and makes visible the stories of people most impacted by Rikers Island to mobilize action toward repairing its generational harms and interrupting the dehumanizing narratives about people harmed by Rikers.
3 organizations, Freedom Agenda, Create Forward, and Humanities Action Lab, decided to come together to form this partnership under the umbrella of the Rikers Public Memory Project. And everything that we are doing centers around closing Rikers Island jails and reinvesting in directly impacted communities.
So Mass Story Lab was an opportunity to combine some of what I learned about like restorative justice and transformative justice with storytelling work to bring people together, around centering story to imagine other possibilities for justice. So we did that project for 3 years. And we traveled to 13 cities and worked with lots of different community groups across the country. And that project really became the forerunner of what is now the Rikers Public Memory Project.
So States of Incarceration emerged kind of from the Guantanamo Project as a similar mode. It was a sort of collective reckoning with the history of mass incarceration that invited university students and others directly impacted by incarceration in 20 different cities or 20 different communities to dig into the roots of incarceration in their particular locality. And we had just decided that the New York team was going to focus on Rikers as their kind of like local story.
The Close Rikers campaign was launched in April 2016. It was launched at a moment where the torture and of Khalif Browder on Rikers Island had become, public knowledge, and there was at that time media attention around that, and the federal government had just joined a lawsuit against New York City because of the conditions on Rikers Island, and particularly the high rates of use of force by correction officers. The campaign leaders felt like it was a time to really focus organizing energy on actually achieving closure. I think of the Rikers Public Memory Project as this really important parallel component to the campaign to close Rikers, which is to ensure that we're really able to hold enough space for the narrative shift and the long view conversation about how to address the harms of Rikers.
Following Khalif's death, the Independent Commission on New York City Criminal Justice and Incarceration undertook a year-long study on the conditions on Rikers Island and released a report calling for its closure.
The next time that we connected about this idea was when the Lippman Commission submitted its report that in addition to closing Rikers, they also recommended sort of a museum or memorial, or, they had sort of memory as articulated as an essential part of closing.
Rikers Island is a stain on our great city. It leaves its mark on everyone it touches.
When he first got arrested, I was in total shock. Then I was in total grief. Then I was in total loss of knowing what to do. So years kept going by. And then one day I woke up and I said, what's going on? This is already 5 years. And I am just crying still. I can't be crying anymore. This is 5 years. Now I'm getting angry. I was so angry and so upset. And I started Googling organizations online that I could reach out, and I called every organization that I would find in phone numbers or emailing, searching that I need to do something, but I cannot do it alone.
You can't really lead a grassroots campaign to close Rikers without questioning the whole premise of Rikers. People who've been incarcerated on Rikers demonstrating clearly their leadership and their potential and their value as New Yorkers and contributors to our city, that I deeply believe that itself impacts the narrative that people have about incarceration and about Rikers Island. But the Rikers Public Memory Project, I think, is a space to dig in more on that and figure out ways that reaches a larger audience and maybe reaches people in other ways.
At every single phase of this project, we have turned towards the individuals who have, faced Rikers firsthand, and asked them, what should this project look like? What will really make the difference?
The three, components of the project, the oral history, the mobile exhibit, and the public health initiative, those three specific areas of the project came out of, this year-long fact-finding from different communities. We were in different communities and people talking about how they want Rikers remembered in the way they want it remembered. So, just from the inception of the project, it was driven by people directly impacted.
The challenge with, doing this kind of work, this work around cultural change, is that it isn't always so tangible or measurable all the time. I think what we have been successful at doing is creating a approach to storytelling, to public memory work that centers those who have been most directly impacted. That is very sort of, consultative on a level that most projects aren't.
To date, the Rikers Public Memory Project has collected over 100 oral histories. This is the largest collection of oral histories about Rikers Island in existence. These oral histories have been donated to the New York Public Library to ensure their long-term preservation. Why is it so important to share, hear, and remember stories about Rikers Island.
Stories are adaptive, and they shape our behavior. You know, the narratives that we tell over and over again become our realities.
As a scholar, you know, I've kind of looked at like, oh, that's a sort of theoretical framework to think about this place. Like, there's also these really fantastic kind of contexts that you get from it too, and language that I think we get to understand the impact of Rikers that I don't think a psychologist, sociologist, historian, anyone who hasn't been in there can figure out. And so that's the other thing, is that if we're going to actually really document and look at the harm done, those oral histories also tell us how to understand it.
I am so many things. And I was so many things prior to this experience. I'm not saying this one experience changed my whole life. I'm a culmination of all my life experiences, right? But this having been probably the most negative one in my life, and that I came out winning, is choice. You know, I really believe that people need to know that they are valid and important, and their stories are important, and that their stories can really help change the trajectory of someone else's life.
The power of storytelling is also, like, as a mobilizing tool, like, you know, it's incredibly painful for the storytellers, and it's incredibly re-traumatizing, and like, it, you know, it's a real sacrifice that everybody is making to go through that again and to share their stories.
I think it's really different than other organizations I've worked for. When I worked at the museum historic site, where I was at for about 9 years in Philadelphia, it was primarily targeted towards like a white middle-class tourist audience engaging with issues of criminal justice and mass incarceration, potentially for the first time, you know, ever on a deep level. So it's really different to work for a project like the Rikers Project that is really centering people who have been traumatized by Rikers and operating as a sort of community truth and reconciliation organization.
My first participation in the project was as a volunteer transcriber. I started around the end of summer 2020, and I was participating in meetings with other volunteers where we would come together and spend 1 or 2 hours together to transcribe everyone together in silence, of course, in our headphones. Those meetings were fantastic, especially since listening to the recordings can be, you know, challenging, emotionally challenging. And so by being together in that, even in that virtual space, we were able every now and then to stop, take a pause, chat a bit, reflect together on what we heard, or maybe even take a moment to recenter ourselves in order to be able to continue doing the work of transcribing.
Because our project has primarily been like grassroots, partner funded, it requires a lot of volunteers. Fundamental to all of that is making sure that we have this ecosystem of care and using like trauma-informed approaches with everyone that has like a touch point on the project.
Just seeing how Rikers Public Memory Project works as an organization and the care that they have for each other, and the care that's been bestowed upon me and that I've been able to give to others, like, it's really what I think we need as a community to grow and change these structures and institutions. Yeah, it just kind of just shines a light on how the government doesn't take care of us, we take care of us. And seeing that like firsthand through this project has been really beautiful for me.
Since I left the island in August 2003, I've been an organizer and advocate for everything against the prison mill industrial complex, and, you know, anything against mass incarceration, specifically Rikers Island, because that's where I did my time. So someone knew about the project and invited me, and I was interviewed by Tamika Graham. You kind of relive, depending on the question, you kind of relive the experience there at you know, the experience of incarceration. So it was challenging. I believe I cried in my interview.
Initially, when we were talking about we were going to collect these oral stories, the idea was that we were going to archive them and gift them to the New York Public Library. And then the pandemic hit, and then the libraries all shut down. So there was no movement for almost, over a year. So we had to ask ourselves, are we going to just wait until the library is ready for us? We don't know when that's going to be. Because of that closed door, that momentarily closed door, it created all of this other innovation, right? So we had to rethink how we were going to share our stories.
It's hard because when you do finally get out, okay, if there's not places like this, where I'm at now, where there's so much help, you're literally in the street, So you go in the street and it's a revolving door. I'll be back in Rikers Island in 90 days tops.
It is, if you go to certain neighborhoods in New York City, neighborhoods that have sort of, been forced to serve as like feeder neighborhoods for Rikers, you see the way that human capital is extracted from these communities and put on to, this island that has been called Torture Island. And all of those people come back home. And with them, when they return home, they bring the trauma of that experience with them. And if there's one person in your neighborhood, your family, and your community that is experiencing trauma, the people around them are going to feel the consequences of that as well. It has a ripple effect, right? Trauma doesn't just affect one person, it affects everyone around you.
My son is out of Rikers Island. He's home. He was never given a trial. They never received a trial because after all the trauma that he underwent in Rikers Island, he decided that he was so scared. And they kind of do it on purpose as a tactic. They wear you down, you stay there for 6 years, you get abused, you get so vulnerable and so fragile that at the end you accept a plea deal. And that's what they wanted to give him, a plea deal. And he accepted it because he told me, I'm so worn out, I'm so weak, I cannot face a trial at this point, 6 years later.
That's C95 for you. That's the worst intake in Rikers Island. And you can't make a phone call. Your people are trying to call the jail and they're trying to derail them from let them knowing you're in the pens for 6 days. Like this, it's the most inhumane, cruelty. Torture chambers are in C95. Those are torture chambers. They're very dark, desolate, dirty. You can't see any light, minimal light. Most unsanitary conditions. Piss, shit, milk, food, all over.
I didn't want my family coming to see me when I was on the island because that whole visitation process. I was visiting people who were on Rikers Island. You know what I mean? I knew people who were locked up there before I got locked up, and I would visit. And that whole process is just so degrading. You feel like a criminal yourself. You know what I mean?
The more I dug, the more stuff there was. Then we find this New York Times article that's like, to build a bigger jail. And it's from the 19th century. So it's like, there was an intention there to build this humongous facility to literally disappear unwanted New Yorkers. Then I discovered these government reports from the beginning of Rikers that said, this place is not healthy for human beings to live. The thing that kind of started to happen is I realized that what we talk about in terms of the conditions at Rikers now also existed when it first began. If I were to show you all of these sort of different reports of incidents there and cover the dates up, you would not be able to tell the difference. Like stopped being able to tell the difference between like 1950 and 1990. It was really alarming to sort of see that there is this consistency there. So I think that the most important part of the history is that like this place is the way it is on purpose. It was designed that way. It was not designed for human beings to live in at all.
I saw a op-ed by, I think it was Neil Barsky of the Marshall Project, was making this analogy between Rikers and Guantanamo. And it was saying, like, we have to close Rikers the way we campaign to close Guantanamo.
The Rikers Island complex is New York's Guantanamo Bay, a secluded island beyond the gaze of watchdogs where the Constitution is no guide. It is a place that has outlived its usefulness.
The fact that he had to get his readers' attention on Rikers by comparing it to Guantanamo kind of blew my mind, because I was like, Guantanamo is this like tiny US military outpost in the remote part of Cuba that like nobody can go visit. But the campaign around it has made it somehow more visible and more recognizable as a sort of place of incarceration and a symbol of the abrogation of like human rights than this jail that is our city's jail that's right here.
I think the type of organizing that the Rikers Public Memory Project sits most fully in is around narrative shift. And that is when you're also working on legislative organizing and you're trying to like pass specific proposals or work on the timeline of the state legislative calendar or the city legislative calendar. It's sometimes really hard to carve out enough space to work on the really enduring narrative shift that makes legislative wins able to stand and not be, sort of threatened or eroded later.
Prisons and punishment and criminal justice are so sort of central to the American story. And yet, I think a lot of people are still pretty in the dark about how the criminal legal system works, who gets caught up in that system, who generally has the privilege of avoiding that system.
You could close Rikers and still have most people or a lot of people operating from a very wrong story about what Rikers was, even if it doesn't exist. And I think that even like the incorrect memory of that is harmful to the chances of our change, the changes that we want enduring.
But I think fighting against the prevailing public narrative has been difficult. Really, really difficult. And so there's such this sensational idea that Rikers is where, like, I call it like the place where supervillains go.
Rikers Island Penitentiary first appeared in Superman Volume 2, Number 9 in 1987. Far from being supervillains, in reality, 84% of the jail population in New York City consists of people in pretrial detention, innocent until proven guilty. People detained at Rikers help each other survive, and many become organizers and leaders in the fight to change the system.
I would not have survived jail had it not been for the camaraderie of the women who I was incarcerated with. When you don't have things and you don't have commissary yet to buy the things you need, I'm talking about sanitary products, things like that, food, because the food is disgusting. They will look out for you without asking anything in return. Like, you felt like I couldn't believe that people showed kindness to each other. When we were in our worst, we were at our low in our life, you know what I mean? But that to me was really quite amazing.
When you look at the history of prison organizing in this country, which dates back to the 1950s, 1960s, what you see is that the leadership and the strategy and the impetus for so much of the organizing has come from inside, right? That people have for a very long time been organizing and mobilizing And we have to always take our leadership for them because they understand firsthand what this system is and what it was created to do.
I think Rikers should be remembered for exactly what it is. It should be remembered as an institution of oppression. It should be remembered as a symbol of racism. It should be looked at as a sign of archaic laws and policies that just need to be revamped and done away with. Because even though we scream close Rikers and we want Rikers to close now, that's not a quick answer. Close Rikers is not a statement, it's a conversation that needs to be had.
I think it's really integral and fundamental to our democracy that we have conversations around the role of prisons and jails, who is incarcerated, who is not incarcerated. And I think that projects like the Rikers Project have a role to play in actually, pushing policy changes and activating enough public interest to actually kind of shift not only the narrative about who is criminalized and the consequences of that criminalization, but also policy and kind of general sentiment around what we do with people who break the law and what are our laws for and are they fair and just, and all these other questions that we can activate through dialogue and through projects like the Rikers Project.
In the next goal, we hope that we can really make the case for reparative justice, right? To repair the harm of Rikers once it's closed, as it's closing.
Unfortunately, the damage to us, to my son, to our family is already done. And it's there. It's not gonna go away. It's done, it's part of our life now, it's part of our experience. But I speak and I keep talking about Rikers because I don't want this to happen to other people, but it's still going on, it's still happening. People are dying on Rikers Island as we speak today.
Storytelling allows us to go deeper with our hearts and minds, which creates space to transform and to be transformed.
You shut the island down and then what? You're gonna forget about it? I don't think so. It needs to be remembered.
To highlight the impact of incarceration and what that means for all of us, because we have similarities, but we have differences. It's really an honor.